Test. All right. Welcome to today's live, everybody. If you haven't met me before, I'm Jonathan with the Institute of Human Anatomy. We do these weekly lives with our community, and we've opened it up to the YouTube community so they can kind of see what our community gets to experience. And we'll have some questions that we answer from our community that they've actually put in a little bit earlier. But we like to do these little small, I guess you could say, lectures on certain aspects of human anatomy and physiology that we're focusing on each month in our community app. And today is the heart. So we've got our little fancy pants screen that we're going to use to try to help you navigate going through the heart. And so we'll do a little bit of a lecture presentation for 10, 15 minutes or so, go over the heart, how it works as far as like the chambers, the blood flow, even talk about the valves, and then we'll actually show you on the cadaver dissection. So let's get going with our discussion on the human heart. So here, what you're looking at is a frontal section of the heart, so you can see the inside chambers here. And one of the cool things about the heart is it's actually made up of 3 different layers here. And so if you look here, we're going to underline and label the heart. And what we first have here is the epicardium. And epi means upon, cardium is just referring to the heart. And I'll label the epicardium. This is just the outer layer of the heart where you can see that little arrow there. And it's made of epithelial tissue that you can see here. Now, epithelial tissue is a highly cellular tissue. We go into all the details of epithelial tissue when we do our histology lectures. But epithelial tissue are made of these cells that help to either like secrete, protect. They're usually lining organs. And in this case, the epithelial tissue is lining the epicardium. So if I asked you, what is the epicardium made out of? You would say it's made out of epithelial tissue. Technically, mesothelium is what they'll call it when it's lining the outside of the organs, plus connective tissue. And specifically, the connective tissue is going to be adipose tissue or fatty tissue. So all of us have a little bit of fat surrounding our heart, part of that outside layer there. Our next layer, let me change the colors here, is the myocardium. Now, the myocardium, my means muscle, cardi, again, referring to the heart. And that's this thick middle layer of the heart that you see. And it's made of these muscle cells, the cardiac myocytes. And these are striated muscle fibers. And so if I ever say muscle fibers and muscle cells interchangeably, they're referring to the same thing. But these muscle fibers are what actually contract and make the heart beat. And this is by far the thickest layer of the heart that you're seeing here, that myocardium. And just as a fun little FYI, in a lot of our videos, we talk about exercise and exercise adaptations. One, the myocardium can change dramatically. We have some questions from our community that I'll address at the end specifically on that. One thing that's really cool about the inside of the cardiac muscle fibers is that they tend to have the most and largest mitochondria when you compare them to all the other muscle tissues like skeletal muscle tissue and even smooth muscle tissue. So kind of cool there. Now, the connective tissue component of the myocardium is just that those muscle fibers are actually wrapped into some connective tissue. If you've taken an anatomy class before, maybe you've heard that the muscle fibers are wrapped in this tissue called endomysium and paramysium. You'll see that a lot when you talk about specifically skeletal muscle fibers, but you'll have those connective tissues wrapping around the cardiac muscle fibers as well. And that's what we have here. So I just want to kind of review here one of these concepts that we have here. When we're talking about the actual layers, that's the name of it. And you're obviously seeing that we're going over like what each layer is made out of. And so the epicardium, made out of an epithelial tissue, specifically they call it mesothelium, and some fatty tissue. And then we go to the myocardium, that's the name of the layer, made out of completely different stuff, specifically the muscle fibers. And then we've also got those connective tissues there. Now our last one that we'll take a look at, and I just deleted some of that, but that's okay, is the endocardium. Endo means within. And so this is the inside lining of the heart. And so if I drew an arrow here, it would just essentially be all that inside lining of the chambers, the ventricles, and the atrial chambers. And this is also made of an epithelial tissue. In this case, they call it endothelium because it's inside the heart, and we even have endothelium on the inside of the blood vessels. And we have a little bit of loose connective tissue in there making up that endocardium as well. So again, we've got those 3 layers, epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Each one is made out of a different tissue, with the exception that you share some similarities with the epithelial tissue. And so they have different functions. And the reason why you want epithelial tissue on the inside lining of the chambers and inside the vessels is it creates this really smooth interface with the blood. And that kind of helps blood flow and move throughout the vessels as well as the heart. And so let's move on to the next part that we have here. So now we're going to just go into the chambers of the heart. And I just want to orient you to this. This is the anterior view of the heart. I've always, if I had a slideshow, I'd try to superimpose it on my chest here. But this part right here is referred to as the apex. And then the upper portion back here would be referred to the base. This would be more of the base of the heart that you could see on the posterior view here. And we'll address all these vessels here. But this is why the heart is sometimes referred to as being on the left side of the chest. That's a little bit misleading because really the sternum would go down right through the center of the heart. And we just have that apex pointing to the left. So it is a little more left bias, but it's not like when I was a little kid doing like the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd always have my hand way over here. The heart's more centralized right behind the sternum here. And so let me orient you to some of the chambers that we're going to see. We have 4 chambers that make up the heart, the 2 atrial chambers and the 2 ventricular chambers. And so let's use a specific color here. And I'm going to use a specific color for a reason. So right here, we're seeing the right atrium. And I'm coloring this in blue for a reason because we're going to talk about deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood in just a little while. But then down here, we have the right ventricle. And let me label that on this side as well. Over here we have, this is the back side of the right atrium. And then we've got a little bit of the, I'm going to draw an arrow to it, right ventricle, because I don't have enough room to write it there. Now I'm going to change the color to red here because the other side of the heart's going to be dealing with oxygenated blood. So I'll just draw an arrow to the piece of the left atrium that we can see on this anterior view. And then here we've got the left ventricle right there. But on the other side, you can see a big chunk of the left atrium here and then left ventricle here. Again, we've done those colors specifically because we're going to be dealing with oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. And so what we'll start with is the atrial chambers, our receiving chambers, and then move down into our ventricles here. Again, the atria. Very exciting. Okay, so again, we see this anterior view of the heart that we have right here. And let me just again label that right atrium here. Now, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood, and it receives deoxygenated blood from 3 vessels here. Now, just think deoxygenated blood is oxygen that's been stripped of the oxygen and essentially exchanged with carbon dioxide. When we're going through cellular metabolism, we have arteries taking blood to the tissues that are oxygenated. And in general, most of the arteries are oxygenated. We'll get to an exception in a little bit. But we're taking oxygenated blood to the tissues. The capillaries exchange that oxygen for carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is a metabolic byproduct. And then that carbon dioxide rich blood or that deoxygenated blood will go back to the right side of the heart. And it's going to enter through a couple of different vessels here. Our first one that we have here is the superior vena cava. And we'll label this right here, SVC. Now, the superior vena cava is going to drain blood from the head, the neck, and your upper limbs, and essentially the upper third of your torso here. You could just draw like a line through your chest or right kind of through the nipple line, and everything above that will be drained by the superior vena cava. Then we've got our inferior vena cava right here, IVC, and that's essentially going to drain blood from everywhere else below. So think the rest of your trunk and your lower limbs are going to be, that blood will eventually drain into that inferior vena cava. Now, the coronary sinus, I don't have a picture of it on this view, but I will rotate it around and show you in just a second. But the coronary sinus actually drains blood from the heart itself. Think we had all those cardiac muscle cells that are going to be working and contracting and very busy, so they're going to create metabolic byproducts like carbon dioxide, and they also need oxygen and other energy sources and nutrients to actually contract. And so they are going to produce carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide rich blood coming from the heart itself will drain into that right atrium from the coronary sinus there. And so I might be able to show you on this next slide here. Yes. So let me just show you where it would be imposed in this heart here, right here, and then I'll show you some other things. So here we have it. This is essentially that coronary sinus. In a real heart, and I'll show you on the real heart, it's essentially a vein that just collapses, and so it doesn't hold its shape very well. So you have to look closely on the back side of the heart. But this is the coronary sinus, and all of these cardiac veins are going to drain into it and bring deoxygenated blood through that coronary sinus back into the right atrium. So now we'll come back to the story of the deoxygenated blood in the right atrium in just a second, but we're going to shift to the left side for a second here. And so let me reset here. So this view of the left atrium is a posterior view, and I'm going to change the color again because the left side of the heart is dealing with oxygenated blood. So here we have our left atrium right there, posterior view, and you can see some associated vessels here. We have left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins. Pulmonary just refers to the lungs. So we're bringing oxygenated blood back from the lungs. And now just keep in mind, if you haven't heard this before, we have skipped some steps because we're going to find that we go from the right atrium to the right ventricle, then to the lungs, reoxygenate the blood, and bring it back to the left atrium. So we skipped those steps with the right ventricle and the lungs here, but we'll put it all together at the end. But the left atrium, again, we're going to have, this is a posterior view here, so you kind of have to rotate it in your mind here. So this would be the left side over here, and then, whoa, I'm stepping on things, tripping. And then we got the right side over here. So here we would have the left, we'll say the left pulmonary veins, and then we'd have the right pulmonary veins here. And so the right pulmonary veins are just bringing oxygenated blood from the right lung, and the left pulmonary veins are bringing oxygenated blood from the left lung. So we've got our atrial chambers taken care of. Let's move into the ventricles, and then we'll kind of put everything together after we do the ventricles here. So, yes, we're doing the ventricles. Cool. So again, you've seen this view here. The ventricular chambers are essentially these chambers here and these chambers here. And we're going to show you an internal view here just to give you the difference between the right and the left ventricle. Okay, so let's start with that right ventricle. And again, because I love drawing on this thing now, the right ventricle is going to be dealing with deoxygenated blood. So I'm going to do it in blue. And maybe I should pause and clarify that. When we're talking about, the reason why we do this color change is if you've ever drawn blood, typically they'll draw blood from a vein, and most of your veins have deoxygenated blood in them. And when the blood is deoxygenated, it has a different color, literally. It looks almost borderline purplish, and whereas oxygenated blood is more of that crimson red color. And so that's kind of what we do in these anatomy lectures to signify the difference, because literally if you go to a clinic and you look at the difference between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, or like in a lab where they draw the blood, you would see a color in that, because when hemoglobin gets saturated with oxygen, it creates this red color here. So the right ventricle here we have highlighted there, and there is an associated blood vessel here, the pulmonary trunk. And so what we're going to see here is this big vessel right here is the whoops, I'm going to erase that. That's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Okay. Here we have the P. I keep doing that. Erase again. Wait for it. I'll just erase that part of it. Yes, there we go. I can spell. Pulmonary trunk, and I changed the opacity there. Thanks, everybody, for the patience there. So now we have the pulmonary trunk. So pulmonary trunk is going to take this deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle. It's going to shove the blood into the pulmonary trunk, and then we have a left pulmonary artery, and then behind, we can't see it, we'd have a right pulmonary artery. So I do want to pause here for a second. A lot of the times people will say arteries have oxygenated blood. Arteries have oxygenated blood, but there's a huge exception right here. So I always try to tell students, instead of saying arteries have oxygenated blood and veins have deoxygenated blood, I always just say arteries away. Most of the time, yes, they have oxygenated blood, but here we have a case where these pulmonary arteries have deoxygenated blood. So arteries away, veins bring blood back to the heart. Now let's jump over to the left ventricle. And we've got LV right here. And the left ventricle is going to pump blood into the aorta, which I'll just put a big A right here. And the aorta is the largest artery in the human body. I'll show you on the cadaver dissection. If you've watched some of our YouTube videos before, you've probably seen that. It is the size of a garden hose. This is kind of your super highway of arteries. And it arches up, like you can see right here. Here's the aortic arch. And then it moves down your torso through the thorax. And about this close to your belly button, it'll split. So it's a big tube. And think of it as this major highway or this major freeway. And as it moves down through the trunk, it's going to have freeway exits, you can kind of think, or off branches where you're going to see blood vessels going to the head, the neck, and the upper limbs, and then it'll distribute blood into the trunk and the torso, and then it'll branch down to become the common iliac arteries and things of that nature to actually distribute blood to the lower body. But this is kind of our picture here that we've had. We've got our ventricular chambers, and I should probably really specify and go into a little bit more detail of these ventricles. These are much, much more powerful than the atrial chambers. These are kind of the powerhouses of pumping. When you think of the heart pumping, think the ventricles. And we'll even see a difference in the right ventricle compared to the left ventricle in just a second here. But I do want to do that now, actually. So what you can see here is we've got our chambers here. We've done this frontal section through here. We've cut through. And you can see the opening into the right atrium and the left atrium here. And then we've got the right ventricle and the left ventricle right there. And one of the things that we can see, I'll just label that, left ventricle. And then we've got right ventricle. And so we've got these open chambers. And this is something that we want to really look at, the myocardial thickness there. The myocardial thickness is different between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And this picture does a pretty good job here. You can see here is the wall thickness of the right ventricle, and it's even thicker on the left ventricle. We'll see in the cadaver dissection, it's even more dramatic, but I always love asking the students, well, why is that? Why is the right ventricle, that right ventricular wall, thinner than the left ventricular wall? And the answer is because the right ventricle only has to pump blood to the lungs, which are literally, if we had them right here, right next door. We got our lungs right next door and our heart right in the center. So you don't need as much strength to pump the blood to the lungs. Whereas the left ventricle, it's going to pump that blood into the aorta and essentially to the entire body. So it has more work to do, and it literally makes the myocardium, that muscle tissue that makes up the heart, even thicker. It's quite remarkable, and like I said, I'll show you on the cadaver dissection. But let me show you some other things here. I'm just going to mention a couple things that we'll get to when we get to the cadaver dissection. There's some cool, unique features about the heart that we can see when it comes to the atrial chambers and the ventricular chambers, specifically with the muscle. On this particular picture, we can't see the pectinate muscle very well. Pectinate refers to comb, but when I show you these muscle fibers on the cadaver, you're going to see why, oh yeah, I can see why they called it a comb. But what's really cool about the pectinate muscle is they only make up a portion of the atrial chambers. And the pectinate muscle is essentially your primitive heart, meaning it was your embryonic heart. These were the chambers, the atrial chambers that started to form first. And they're kind of remnants of that little atrial chamber that was pumping when you're inside mom developing. But then as you develop more, what happens is the right atrium and the left atrium start pulling in pieces of those veins and arteries that we saw, like the superior and inferior vena cava and even the pulmonary veins. What happens is it makes the chamber even bigger, but you'll see part of the chamber is really smooth, like the inside of a blood vessel. And then the other portion, that where that pectinate muscle is, that was where the embryonic or the beginning of the atrial chamber formed. And so we'll show you some cool features with that in just a second. Now, these you can see on this particular cadaver dissection. If you look closely, you can, I'll just outline some of them. You can see these little beams of muscle. I won't cover them all, so you can still actually see them there. A beam in anatomy is referred to as a trabecule, and carne is referring to the meat. So these look like beams of meat, and these are really powerful beams of muscle that make up the ventricular chambers, and they're just a very distinct feature. And so, of course, anatomists had to name them these little beams of muscle. Now, some of my favorite are these papillary muscle. Maybe I'll change the color on you, actually, so you can see them a little bit better. I'm going to show the papillary muscle in yellow here. These little structures here, and I'll just circle put some dots on them right there so you can see them. The papillary muscle, or papillary refers to nipple, and these are extensions of the trabeculae carneae, and these attach to these cool little cords called the chordae tenonii, and I'm going to hold off on those because I'll show you those on the valves when we get there. But these little papillary muscles are going to be very important for our atrioventricular valves. Maybe you've heard of the specific atrioventricular valves before, like the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, sometimes referred to as the mitral valve. I know that's a lot of names there, but those are really cool, and we'll be able to show you those on the cadaver dissection as well. So we're kind of giving us some pieces here to the puzzle. We're showing you the chambers, how the right side of the heart is deoxygenated and the left side of the heart is dealing with oxygenated blood. And we've shown you some of the key features of those specific chambers. And now we're actually going to go right into those valves here. So let me just define each one of these really quick. The atrioventricular valves that we're seeing here are, I'm going to circle them for you here. So our atrioventricular valves, I'll put them in yellow here. So just break down that name though. Atrioventricular is a valve between the atrium and the ventricle. So our right one, which is actually referred to as the tricuspid valve, that's the right atrioventricular valve. And then over here, we have the left atrioventricular valve, most often referred to as the bicuspid valve. That was not very good writing there. That's an R, just so everybody knows, and that's a T for tri. I'm just making it worse there. But those are the specific valves that we're going to see between the two atrial chambers. And let's talk to you about the specific structures that make them up. So we're going to highlight each one in a little bit of a different color. So we'll use red for the cusps. So, and I'll just put a little dot on each one. So here's the cusps of those valves here. And the tricuspid valve, why it's called the tricuspid valve is because it has 3 of those cusps. I can get the other one maybe a little bit underneath there. And then the bicuspid valve is because it has 2 cusps. Now, the next thing we're going to see are these chordae tenonii, or tendinii is actually how they're pronounced. And I'm going to try to do my best to do a little 3D circling there. Those are those chordae tenonii. They're so cool to see on the actual cadaver dissection. I know I keep hinting and teasing that, but we're going to see them. These are little tendinous cords that connect the cusps with the actual papillary muscle that we can highlight in green. So here we are. I'll put dots on those papillary muscles right there. And so let's kind of just take a second to actually give you an idea of how this would work. When I was a little kid, I loved it whenever I got into a house that had saloon doors. Saloon doors were cool for me as a little kid because you could just run back and forth through them and they'd swing both ways, right? And so kind of think of these valves as a modified saloon door. And so let's say we went to that house with a saloon door, and on one side of that saloon door, we somehow attached ropes to one side. And then we took those ropes and strung them out. I don't know, maybe we bolted them down to the floor or did something like, or mounted them somewhere. Let's say, just say the floor, that'll make it easy. Now, if we tied those ropes at the right length, we could go back, swing through that door, and if we tied the ropes to the right length, it would put slack in the ropes and we could enter that room. Stop the doors from swinging back the other direction. And so kind of think of atrioventricular valves, specifically the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, actually working in that way. But they're even more sophisticated with that, because with my little analogy there, I was like, oh, let's just bolt them or somehow staple them down to the floor. But we get something better. Our floor analogy are these papillary muscles there. And these papillary muscles, as the ventricle contracts and squeezes more forcefully, that would almost want to make the door go backwards against the ropes, if you will, in the wrong direction. But as that valve starts to get pushed further and further back in the wrong direction, those papillary muscles will just contract and squeeze and put more tension on those chordae tenonii, and therefore keep the doors or those cusps from flopping back the other way. Super sophisticated and really cool valves that can pull and contract harder, because remember, as the heart contracts more forcefully, those papillary muscles will have to contract more forcefully, just because there's going to be more pressure in the heart with more forceful contractions. So hopefully that gives you kind of a good idea on how those atrioventricular valves work. Now let's go to the valves or the arterial outlets here. So here we're going to see our pulmonary valves and our pulmonary valve and our aortic valve. So let's do the pulmonary valve first, which you can see right there. I keep doing R's instead of P's there. I don't know what's going on here. Let's do the clear here. Okay. We have pulmonary valve, and that's going to be in the blue there. And then we have our aortic valve here. So we can see just a little piece of it right there. AV for aortic valve. Okay, so let's just talk about the structure here. You're going to see the structure. We have 3 juxtaposed semilunar cusps. And this picture does a good job showing you that there's 3 little cusps here, and then we can see 2 of the 3 on that aortic valve. Now, these ones will open when the ventricles contract and are trying to force the blood out. And what we're going to do with our actual review of when we talk about the blood flow through here, we're going to see that when one set of valves are open, the other ones will be closed. So, for example, when the tricuspid valves open, that pulmonary valve should be closed. And when that ventricle squeezes, that'll force that open and allow blood to go to its respective areas, depending on if we're in the pulmonary valve or the aortic valve. If we pass through the pulmonary trunk and then go through the pulmonary valve, we're going to go to the lungs. If we're on the left side of the heart, we're going to squeeze that left ventricle, push open the aortic valve, and then go out the aorta and distribute the blood throughout the body here. Now, these are less sophisticated. They don't need to have as much, sophistication or anatomical structures associated with them because they're not under as much pressure as the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more in just a second. But these are one of the things where sometimes you'll talk about valve disorders with people. Some people will have, essentially you can put valve disorders into 2 categories when you're first learning about them. You can either say the valve's not opening wide enough, or it's too narrow or it's too stiff, and we refer to that as stenosis, or it's not closing enough, and that would create a leaky valve, and we often refer to that as like valve regurgitation. And so let's see if our next picture takes us through. Oh, we have a nice little video here. So we're going to show you just a video of the heart and kind of how it works with its beating. And so you can kind of just see how cool that is as the valves are taking turns opening and closing. It's kind of therapeutic to watch that. Okay. So let's see here. What's our next one here? I think I had to pause that. All right. So now I want to do the blood flow and put all this together here. So we've got this section here, and let's just do a scenario here. Let's say let's do a workout. Let's say I'm working my biceps at the gym or something like that, and I'm producing the biceps needs oxygenated blood, and while it's exercising, it's burning through that oxygen and then producing carbon dioxide. Now I'll have some veins associated in my upper limb, like the brachial veins, and that'll take that deoxygenated blood from that working biceps through the axillary vein, subclavian, and then eventually it's going to dump into this thing right here called we learned earlier, the superior vena cava. And so then that blood comes in to that right atrium. Now we could say we're working our quads or doing something else and producing carbon dioxide rich blood. We're not showing it in this picture, but we would have the inferior vena cava and would come through essentially into this area. I don't want to cover up the valve there, so that's why I kind of dodged it there. Now, the heart itself is beating and creating deoxygenated blood, and so we would have blood also entering through that coronary sinus. And so we've got all this deoxygenated blood entering through these various vessels into that right atrium. So now, as the atrial chambers squeeze, and they don't squeeze very forcefully, at least when we're comparing them to the actual ventricles, that's going to open that tricuspid valve, and now that deoxygenated blood has made it into that right ventricle. Then the right ventricle will contract, and that blood will not exit where it came from. We don't want it to go backwards, because when the ventricle contracts, what will happen is this valve will close, that tricuspid valve, and then right here, this valve will open up, and then we take that deoxygenated blood to the actual lungs. Now we breathe out that carbon dioxide, breathe in some oxygen, and then we go back to the left side of the heart right here. So, and we'd enter in the left side of the heart through these, I'll draw an arrow like this, through these pulmonary veins. And we'd have some coming from this side as well. They're just not pictured here. They'd be going on the back side of the heart and entering through here and then coming into that left ventricle. I'm sorry, left atrium. So now we've got all this oxygenated blood from the lungs. The atrial chamber, that left atrium, is going to squeeze a little bit. That bicuspid valve will open up, also known as the mitral valve, and we now enter into that left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, and that blood will now have a flip-flop in our actual valves opening and closing. So when that ventricle contracts, the bicuspid valve has to close, the aortic valve opens up, and now we can take all this oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And we'd have the aorta down below because the aorta continues down its merry little way throughout the trunk there. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. I know that's a lot of information about how the heart will work, but that gives you the flow of the human heart. And I've noticed a lot of students, this makes sense to them just because it's this nice circular pattern. And if we applied it back to our exercise routine, this would just be going on all the time when you're feeding a muscle with oxygenated blood and pulling that deoxygenated blood away from the muscle. And it just keeps cycling through. And it wouldn't just be for working muscles. This is essentially all your tissues and structures and other cells throughout the body. We would be delivering this oxygenated blood and pulling the metabolic byproducts like carbon dioxide away from those cells and tissues throughout the body. So I think that will cover us for our little lecture portion here. I'll keep that up for our viewing pleasure here. But I do want to go into the cadaver dissections because a lot of people love seeing that stuff. And then we'll take some questions from our community first. And if we have some extra time, then we will actually open some questions up to the YouTube chat as well. So here we have 4 hearts here. And the reason we have 4 here is because based on the dissection, we'll use different hearts here. But I've laid them all out essentially in the same way, meaning you can see the apex of each individual heart here, the tip right there. But what I love doing with students is showing them certain surfaces of the heart here. Let me do it like this. Now, if you look closely, you can see there's this flat surface on each one of these hearts here. Now, they're obviously slightly different shapes and sizes based on, generally the size differences based on how big the person is. And so like Shaquille O'Neal would have a much bigger heart than say like me, who's only 6'1", and Shaq's like, what is he, 7'2", 7'1", something like that. So kind of cool to think about. Generally, heart size fits the size of the person, and we say sometimes the size of the fist, but that's just a rough estimate. But coming back to these diaphragmatic surfaces right here, I just gave it away. The diaphragmatic surface is the name of these flat surfaces because I love showing students how to orient the heart. So if I pick up this heart and I take that flat diaphragmatic surface, your diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle, but the top of the diaphragm, where the central tendon of the diaphragm is flat. And this flat portion of the heart, the diaphragmatic surface of the heart, plops right down. So I'm going to make myself a flat diaphragm right there. I'm going to plop it on there. And then all I have to do is put the apex where it needs to go, as I touched my shirt there on accident. But the apex just needs to point slightly anterior to the left right there. And this is about how the human heart would sit in the human body, just posterior to the sternum there. And so I always hand these over to students and let them orient it, like make their makeshift diaphragm there and plop the heart down so they can get an idea of how the heart is oriented. But we're going to use this heart. This is our smallest heart here. This came from a body that was actually 5 feet tall, so a very small individual. But it's one of my favorites to teach from because it has a cool set of dissections that we can see here. So again, let me just orient you like so. This is about how it would sit in me. But to see the atrial chambers, I'm going to twist it and show you the posterior view. So I'll kind of tip it up on its apex there and flip it around here. And these are the atrial chambers. I'm going to let you see a closer look here. But here's what we're going to see as the right atrium. And then we're going to see the left atrium. Let me bring it closer to this camera here. So here's this open chamber right here as the right atrium. And then we've got the left atrium right here. Now, what's really interesting about that is there's just a septum called the interatrial septum that divides the two. I'm actually pinching that septum, and my pointer finger is actually in the left atrium, where my thumb is in the right atrium right there. And so let me just show you the internal anatomy here. Remember I said a lot of the atrial chamber is just smooth, and that's when during embryonic development it pulled in some of the veins and made them part of the actual chamber. But this portion, remember how we said that pectinate muscle right there? You can see why pectinate refers to comb, because it almost looks like, I don't know if you'd call them the bristles of a comb, but the pieces of the comb that you'd actually just kind of notice. Everybody gets it when you say comb. But again, what are we going to do here? This atrial chamber is going to contract slightly, and it's going to push the blood, that deoxygenated blood, through the tricuspid valve and enter into that right ventricle. So we've cut a window into the right ventricle here. And one of my favorite things to do is to show students more of that tricuspid valve. One of our hearts has a little bit of a better dissection for that. And I think it is this one. Yes. So this one has a bigger window cut into that right ventricle. Look how cool this is. The cusps, one of the cusps of that tricuspid valve. And that's that saloon door that we'd actually see right there. The other thing that I want to mention is that you can see the trabeculae carni. You can see those beams of muscle if you actually look closely there. You can see all that architecture and those beams of muscle that we see. Now, remember, we have the deoxygenated blood moving from the right atrium into this right ventricle. We don't want the blood to come back where it came from. So again, that right ventricle is going to, that tricuspid valve is going to close. And then we're going to have that blood leave. So this is really cool. We've actually cut open the pulmonary trunk right here. So that blood's going to leave through that pulmonary trunk. We've cut into it, and you can see the pulmonary valve right there. You can see those little tiny semilunar cusps. And these ones are not nearly as sophisticated as the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Essentially, the blood just passes by and actually relaxes. I'll show you the aortic valve, how it would look kind of when it's closed here. Let's see if I can get that in there to your, oh, there we go. You can kind of see that in there. The aortic valve closed there. There's not much light going in there, but you can see those cusps down in there. If I get the probe out of the way here. Okay, now remember, I'm going to step back here. I know I'm repetitive, but I think it helps everybody remember. Right ventricle contracts, opens up that pulmonary valve. The blood goes through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries. We breathe out that carbon dioxide, breathe it back in, or breathe in the oxygen, reoxygenate the blood. And then the blood goes back to the left side of the heart, specifically the left atrium. So if I turn this over again, remember, here was that right atrium, the opening there, but here is the left atrium right there. So again, very smooth. We've cut most of the pectinate muscle out of the way here on this particular section, but you can see that opening into that left atrium. Then we've got to go through a bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, depending on the anatomy book you learned. And now we're in that left ventricle. Now look how crazy this is. There's the wall thickness of the right ventricle. There's the wall thickness of the left ventricle. Huge noticeable difference that you can see, because again, right ventricle is just pumping to the lungs, left ventricle's pumping to the entire body. Speaking of the entire body, that's going to leave through that aortic valve and into the aorta, and here is that aorta. Remember how I said the aorta is the size of a garden hose? Let me pull the probe out of there so we can really see it. You kind of already got a taste of that when I showed you that aortic valve. Let me open it up here. But you can see how this is the size of a garden hose. Huge, huge, amazing artery here. And the last thing I'll mention on these heart dissections is that, ironically, the first place that we need to take oxygenated blood when it leaves that left ventricle is the heart itself. Here's that right coronary artery, and then we even have the left coronary artery. And you can see if we trace that down, it's distributing blood onto the heart muscle itself. And so pretty cool to think about. And these are the arteries that can get blocked with a myocardial infarction, which is that fancy pants name for a heart attack. And depending on where it's blocked, how big of a vessel, if it's one of these smaller vessels, it's going to be a more mild heart attack. If you block this one right here, for example, the left anterior descending one, that's often referred to as the widowmaker, because it's such a big area of the heart that that blood vessel serves. And some people will die from a heart attack that blocks that actual vessel there. Now, I do want to briefly mention here, because that was so long ago I kind of forgot about it. Remember we mentioned the three layers of the heart, the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. we've removed the epicardium on the majority of these hearts, especially this one. So this is all myocardium. We've removed the epicardium. On this one, we've left some of it. You can see some of that fatty tissue down there. We've also kind of removed some of it back on some of the muscular tissue that you can see like right there. We've exposed some of that myocardium, but here's a little bit of that epicardium. Remember, that was epithelial tissue and some of the fat. Get the cause of death of all the people that we have, or all the bodies that come into the lab here, but we don't get their complete medical history. That would be impossible to get their medical history for their entire life. So sometimes we get some surprises. Like, for example, this lead wire to a pacemaker, this heart, you can see the lead there. The actual unit, or the pacemaker itself, we implant those in the chest, not we as in me, but in the medical community. And they put that more superficial. That's where the battery pack is and the control unit is. And that makes sense, because if you have to replace that, that'd be much less of an intense or invasive surgery if it's just under the skin, rather than actually getting all the way to the heart itself. So the placement of the lead is very important, because that's more of an invasive surgery, that you actually have to place the lead in the heart muscle itself. But that lead will go out to the actual control unit where the battery is. And like I said, the control unit to actually control heart rate with somebody who does have a pacemaker. So that was a lot longer than I thought I was going to talk for on the heart, but hopefully you learned some new cool things about the heart and from the pictures and the cool little whiteboard that we're trying to navigate through here. But now we want to open it up to questions from first our community, because we take they put their questions in a few days earlier. And then if we have some time, we'll probably go till noon our time. So we have about 15 minutes to go over some questions. So I'm going to ask Amanda and Jen and Jeremy, who are here with us, that you don't see behind the cameras. By the way, shout out to Amanda for finding our cool anatomy pictures here, so on our presentations. But I'm going to let them give me some of the questions that we have from the community. What was the first one we had? I can't remember it.
From Oksana.
Yeah.
Reshniak.
Yes.
I would like to know if it is true that the heart is wrapped in layers of heart muscle fibers that are arranged in a spiral, helical, or vortex-like pattern.
Jen, can you hear him? Does his voice come through?
Sort of.
And kind of come through? Maybe you should come closer, so then I don't have to repeat the question. Sorry, everybody. I just don't have to repeat the question, but if he's close enough to my mic, you should be able to pick his voice up. So
I would like to know if it is true that the heart is wrapped in layers of heart muscle fibers that are arranged in a spiral, helical, or vortex-like pattern.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a question about the myocardium of the heart itself. Like, are these muscle fibers here oriented in, like, I'm going to move it over without my glove here, oriented in a spiral or a different fiber orientation? Now, if you actually get into the probe moving there. If you actually get into the myocardium a little bit more, you can actually break the myocardium down into 3 muscle layers there.